On Newsmakers this week, our guest is Director of the Congressional Budget Office, Phill Swagel, and helping with our questions in studio to veteran tax and economics reporters, Richard Rubin of the Wall Street Journal, Jim Tankersley of the New York Times. Director Swagel, before we get to those questions, for those outside of D.C., explain first what the Congressional Budget Office is, who you answer to, and what viewers should take away from your latest report, your budget and economics outlook.
Oh, okay, yeah, and thanks very much for having me on the program. So the Congressional Budget Office supports the Congress in its budget function. We evaluate legislation, we provide cost estimates of legislation, we do analytic reports on various topics. We had one just come out on student loans, for example, and then we do a host of scorekeeping functions, so in support of the appropriations process, essentially tracking spending and helping Congress figure out basically how much they're spending and how much bills will cost.
Talk about that, who you answer to.
So we're a nonpartisan agency, and we answer to the Congress. We work through the two budget committees, the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee, but we work for the entire Congress. So generally our work is for the chairs and ranking members of the various committees of jurisdiction. So if there's something on healthcare, that would often be in the Senate for the Finance Committee or the Help Committee, and similarly in the House. And so in some sense we answer to all the members and support all the members equally on a nonpartisan basis.
All the members very interested in your budget and economics outlook that came out recently. What's the takeaway from that?
So the takeaway in some sense is twofold. On the economic side, we have continued GDP growth in our forecast, but large budget deficits that persist. So over $1 trillion a year over the next 10 years, and the debt to GDP ratio reaching unprecedented levels over the next 10 years and really over the next 30 years, going up to about 180% of GDP, a level never seen before. And that's what's striking, is that conjunction of an economy and a labor market that's really in pretty good shape, especially on the labor market, and a budget deficit that is wide and getting wider.
What's the tipping point? What's too much?
You know, we don't know. We know that as the debt to GDP ratio rises, that will have some negative effects on the U.S. economy, right? It eventually will lead to a drag on consumer spending and business investment through the effect on interest rates. Even though we don't see that now, we know at some point it will. And rising debt makes the U.S. economy more vulnerable in the future. So if our debt level is higher and interest rates do rise, that will make our fiscal challenge all the more difficult. So we don't know exactly when that tipping point will come, but we know there's a rising vulnerability from the fiscal trajectory.
And to jump off of that, so you had, a lot of people would have said a decade ago that if we're at the points we're at now, where deficits and debt to GDP are where they are, that we would already be feeling some of those effects. What was your view on those issues 10 years ago, and have you sort of changed your view about when and how deficits and debt affect the economy as a whole?
Yeah, so there's a sense in which we can look at the economy now and understand why interest rates are low, right? There's a variety of reasons. The growth in the rest of the world has some problems and recent challenges with the virus situation in China and the rest of Asia. That certainly led to lower interest rates in the U.S. And we see that situation. When the rest of the world has a problem, the U.S. economy is a safe haven in a sense, and our treasury bonds are. Inflation has remained low in the U.S., and in some sense the risk-taking appetite of markets and market participants has been lower than I think people expected, and all that leads to lower interest rates. So in some sense we understand it, but you asked, has it changed my view? And sure, 10 years ago, if you told me where we were in the, sort of the economic cycle, 11 years into an upswing, with the unemployment rate at 3.6, no, I would not have expected interest rates to be as low as they are. And that's led to a rethinking in the profession, and certainly at CBO, over the last year since I've been director, we have marked down our projection of interest rates really substantially.
What were you doing 10 years ago, and what did you do before you took this job?
So I'm a professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. I'm on leave from the University of Maryland while serving as CBO director. So 10 years ago, I had left the Treasury Department, where I was the chief economist at the Treasury the last 2 years of the Bush administration, and I was in academia then.
So
speaking of administrations, the president's budget for fiscal year 2021 just came out this week, has very different forecasts on growth and deficits than the CBO forecasts. In the next 10 years, it foresees growth of 3% a year, which we haven't really seen in a long time in the United States. And I'm curious, what do you make of the divergence between your forecasts and the White House's on growth and on deficits?
Yeah, so we're analyzing the president's budget now. It's something that the CBO does every year. We'll have a full report. Jim, as you said, their GDP numbers is pretty different than ours, and the trajectory is different. In a sense, they have a different way of doing the forecast, because their forecast assumes that everything the president has proposed is enacted, and our forecast assumes just current law. So that probably accounts for some of the difference. They have stronger productivity growth than we do as well, and so that would be a difference. We have productivity growth rebounding from the pretty low productivity growth after the financial crisis. So we see better than that, but not a strong productivity growth over the previous decade or two. So that's kind of the main differences.
Are there a set of policies that CBO has modeled that you think could produce that type of productivity growth? As it is now, you sort of see the potential sort of maximum run of the economy as being lower than the White House does also, it seems.
That's right, we do. And so we see longer-term GDP growth settling down at around 1.7%, which, as you said, is lower than the administration's projection. We know there's some policies that would boost growth and boost productivity growth over time. On the growth side, the labor force growth is decelerating, right? So we're an aging society that affects the labor force. We know immigration is one lever that would increase the labor force. That would increase our output, and over time increase GDP and probably productivity growth as well, right? Immigrants bring a diversity and a sort of energy to our economy and innovation, entrepreneurship as well. There's tax policies that would probably support stronger growth, and those are debated, obviously, in the Congress. So there's a variety of levers. It's difficult to know, though, what exactly is the right way to boost productivity growth. In the economics profession, productivity growth is one of the, in some sense, mysteries that is just hard to say what lever will boost productivity growth.
What will be your role in the budget debate over the coming months?
So ours is an analytic one, right? So right now, as you said, we just put out our baseline. Now we're analyzing the president's budget, and then in March we will put out a new baseline that accounts for the actual dollars of spending over the last year. When the president puts out his budget, we get more information on the actual spending over the last year, and so we'll crank through all that and then put out a new baseline in March. And then, as always, CBO will estimate whatever legislation Congress is considering and evaluate the effects of that.
As you think about what legislation you're evaluating, you obviously hear a lot from members on both sides with sort of big ideas. And so I'm curious how you're looking sort of 10 to 12 to 15 months ahead at things like climate legislation, Medicare for all, things that would take a fair amount of analytic work to do. How far along is CBO in its sort of analytical capacity and work on some of those things that a new administration, a new Congress might, but not necessarily bring in the future?
Yeah, it's one of the challenges of the job is to figure out what we need to work on now, because CBO is at its best when we've done the work instances before the legislation comes to us. And one example of that is surprise billing, which is a topic subject of legislation on both the House and Senate and various committees. We have several analysts at CBO who, 11, 12 months ago figured out that this was an important issue and got the data in shape, did the work. And so we have been able to support the Congress with the surprise billing, basically because we had these star analysts who figured it out before I arrived. So that's our challenge now. We're working on some of the issues you mentioned on climate. We know that is an issue that's important to members, both chambers, both parties. And so we're doing the sorts of things you'd expect CBO to do. We're looking at how does climate fit into the baseline. So it's in some micro ways with flood insurance, with military installations, things like that. Now that spending is discretionary spending, so it's annual appropriations. On the longer term, the bigger dollars are probably the overall macro effect on the economy. So we're looking at the research that relates climate change to overall GDP, and then trying to say, okay, how does that feed through to the budget? So it's not attenuated, but it's sort of a, the steps are climate, GDP, spending, revenue, and so on.
Is that reflected at all in the budget, in your baseline now, any sort of economic up or down from climate change? Or like what, how is that in the, or do you expect a sort of baseline adjustment to deal with that?
Yeah. And actually, I can talk about health also. We're preparing some health work as well. The climate change is implicit in the budget now, right? We have a projection for the flood insurance program and so on, but is not broken out separately. We don't have a line that says the effects of climate does this to flood insurance and things like that. But that's what we're working to understand. So it's implicit, and we're working to make it more explicit. And of course, once we have those connections, then we'll be in a better position to analyze policies in the future.
And could that then lead you to a position where hypothetically CBO could score a bill to reduce carbon emissions as being pro-economic growth because it would theoretically reduce the effects of climate change on the economy?
No, that's a good question. Now, CBO under my predecessor, Doug Elmendorf, who was 2 directors ago, did a lot of work on cap and trade legislation. So the apparatus is there, and we're working in some sense to update it. Right? So first we look at the effect of climate on the baseline, and then to update really the analytic tools to evaluate the policies. But the policies, you said, is the sort of thing that we would do, and we'd work jointly with the Joint Committee on Taxation, which does the revenue estimates, to say, well, what's the effect of some policy on the economy, on the carbon and other emissions, and then ultimately, what are the costs? One caution is that the sort of thing of avoiding future disasters doesn't score. Right? So we would talk about it, and we would certainly provide as much information as we can, but in some sense, avoiding future disasters is a good thing, and it has a cost to it.
Now, I can't believe it took us this long with 2 tax reporters to get to taxes, but here we are. The CBO did do a lot of work on the Tax Act that passed in 2017, President Trump's signature tax cuts. You forecast its effects both on revenues and then along with the JCT produced modeling on growth. So I'm curious, 2 years of data now have been collected on the effects of the tax cuts. How do you think CBO's predictions fared, and what have you sort of learned and updated about them in that time?
Yeah. So as you said, CBO has looked a lot at this along with JCT. In April of 2018, so this is before I started under my predecessors, Keith Hall, CBO did a comprehensive evaluation of the December 2017 Tax Act. And overall, it looks like the effects have been in line with our analysis. So the positive impact on GDP growth, it looks about what we expected. It's difficult because, of course, subsequent events and policies in some sense can interfere with the clear signal. So notably, tariff policies put in place starting in 2018 look to have had an effect in holding down business investment. And we expected to see the positive impact of the Tax Act coming through business investment. We saw that in the first half of 2018, and then business investment looks to have been dampened since then. It's just hard to disentangle between the sort of the positives of the tax policy and then the dampening of the tariff policy. But we're still tracking. One caveat is that, of course, many of the tax returns, especially for businesses, were just filed last October, and we don't actually have access to those yet. The JCT gets first access by the end of the year, late in the year, generally October. We will have access to the full file of tax returns working through the JCT. What we do see is the incoming revenue, right? The payments by companies, and on the whole, those are in line with our analysis, but with a couple of important changes that we detailed in a blog post last week. And I can go into those if.
Well, just if you could maybe just tell the viewers, you did estimate that it would reduce revenues over a decade. Can you just sort of talk a little bit about that and the
absolutely.
And to build on that, we had the Treasury Secretary this week sort of reassert the administration view, which is that the tax cuts will not just generate growth, as you said, but generate enough growth to pay for themselves. And so you can sort of elaborate on
Absolutely.
what effect it's having on revenue and whether it is in fact paying for itself.
Okay, absolutely. And maybe I'll start there and then go back to the corporate side, where we're looking carefully at the incoming data and learning more, as Jim, as you said. So on the overall, CBO in April 2018, in this comprehensive analysis, we indicated that the Tax Act would increase growth in an amount that would essentially pay for about 20% of the revenue loss of the Tax Act. And in some sense, this includes all the dynamic effects, right? There'd be stronger growth, that would mean higher revenue, but the stronger growth would also have an effect on interest rates, and that would lead to some increase in net interest outlays. And so the overall of all that is about 20%. So we think roughly it paid for 20% of itself. Again, the administration has a stronger growth outlook, and I haven't done the math, but maybe they have in mind that with a stronger outlook, there'd be more revenue, and that's the sort of thing they might have in mind. But that's our take is the 20%.
Yeah. Go ahead, finish.
Okay. I was just saying, on the corporate side, we've learned a lot in the 2 years. We don't have the returns. And the Joint Tax Committee just put out a really nice report looking at some of the largest corporation returns, which again, that's their role. We're looking at essentially changes in the data, which revise essentially the share of business profits against wages in the economy. It basically said over the previous several years, corporate profits were lower and wages were higher. In a sense, that resolved a bit of a mystery on the corporate tax side, that incoming revenues were weaker than we had expected. And in some sense, that we knew how much money was coming in the door from tax payments. The data indicated that corporate profits were high relative to those tax payments, and now the data revision helped resolve that mystery. So that's one thing. The other thing we have is really 2 years of both the regulations pertaining to the tax law have been put forward by the Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service within the Treasury, and then taxpayers have reacted to that. And so we're seeing some of the incoming revenue as a result, and that also has led us to mark down our expectations of revenues.
With less than 10 minutes left with Phill Swagel, the CBO Director, I want to focus on that for a second. When your projections differ with whether it's the White House or members of Congress, can you talk about what happens then? Do you sit down with those groups and say, this is why we should be looking at this data and this is why we came to this conclusion? How much back and forth is there to try to show them why you projected what you projected?
Oh, okay, sure. So we have a different role than the OMB or Council of Economic Advisors that sometimes does similar things for the president, for the White House. So we look at what they're doing, and we're going to re-estimate the president's budget using our economic assumptions. But we don't try to coordinate that, and so we do different things, and we respect them, and we pay attention to them.
Do they ever try to convince you?
Not on the macroeconomic side. We just, in some sense, it's I think parallel play would be the the metaphor.
Or agree to disagree.
Yeah, exactly. It's not agree to disagree. There's a sense in which we're all talking about what's the economy going to do over the next 10 years. We go out 30 years, and anyone's level of confidence of what GDP is going to be in 8 years, I think everyone should have some humility about that. So we see a wide range of opinions. Look, we think we are in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. So we think we have a very reasonable forecast. It's pretty much in the middle of the distribution of, say, the blue chip forecasters. So it makes us comfortable. We're not sort of out on a limb here. But we recognize the diversity of opinions. And I should just add, at the staff level, we work very well with executive branch agencies, right? So if there's legislation that affects something in a cabinet department, a new program at the Veterans Administration, our analysts would talk to the analysts at the appropriate place and say, okay, how much would it cost you? What would you do? And we use that information in our cost estimates. So there's very good cooperation at that technical level.
You've been on this job about 8 months now?
8 months, that's right.
Do you like it?
It's really interesting. I was about to say it's a lot of fun, which it is also. The people, which only an economist could say that. The people at CBO are fantastic. The economic knowledge, the institutional knowledge is incredible. And issues are just endlessly interesting. And you had asked me before, I didn't answer this directly, but I meant to. And so members of Congress can disagree with us. And in some sense, the challenge and my responsibility is to explain it. Right? If a member says, this is wrong, or a staffer says, this is wrong, can you explain it? I have to be able to explain it in a way that is sensible. And if I can't explain it, I'm not doing my job.
In that 8 months, how many members' opinions have you changed if they come to you and say, this is wrong?
It's not that I'm trying to change opinions. I'm trying to explain, here's why we see it the way.
How many of them have said, oh, I understand why you see it that way now?
It happens. I'm not going to name members, but
you're welcome to.
Yeah, exactly. There's there's just some issues that are. It's not that they're complex, but just trying to think through all the ways that the economy interacts with the budget. So we do a lot of work on healthcare, for example, and so there's provisions that say would affect drug prices, and that has a budgetary impact. Essentially, the federal government subsidizes insurance premiums through the tax code. Right, everything comes back to the tax code. So, the employer-sponsored insurance is tax deductible, and then there's tax premiums through the Affordable Care Act. So anything that changes drug prices can therefore change insurance premiums, and therefore affects the fiscal situation. So just setting that out. I'm not trying to change anyone's opinion or view. I'm just giving the analysis of sort of here's the steps, here's how it works.
I was going to get back to a point that Rich raised earlier, which is that several of the Democrats running for president in this cycle are campaigning on a Medicare for All plan. And if one of those candidates were to win, I'm curious if CBO is equipped to, and if it's harder to analyze plans that we're not talking about billion or $100 billion changes to the economy, but tens of trillions of dollars over 10 years. Well, how does that change the way you approach analyzing a plan if it's just that large and potentially consequential?
Yeah, it's exactly the right question with these large policies. And in a sense, we have to start with humility that the range of uncertainty was something that changes, as you said, the whole economy will be large. So just before I arrived, the CBO put out a report on single-payer healthcare, and my colleagues testified this at the House Budget Committee. So we started building the analytic capacity to analyze those sorts of programs. And in some sense, we're looking very broadly, so at various ways to expand insurance coverage, because we realize there's substantial congressional interest in expanding coverage, whether all the way to universal coverage, such as with a single-payer system, or incrementally building on the Affordable Care Act, putting in a public option. The administration has put forward an HRA rule as health reimbursement accounts, and so we're looking at that as well, at how that will affect the healthcare system. So we're building capacity in some sense in all of these ways, as you said, to be ready, right? To be ready if in 2021, whatever direction policy goes, we're hoping to be ready.
I want to come back to budget deficits. I hear from readers, I'm sure you hear from members, that a balanced budget should be a goal. Is that a worthy goal, and what are the levers one could pull to get there if you think if that's something worth doing?
Yeah, in some sense, the CBO, we don't say what the goals are because intrinsically that involves value judgments, and so our role would be to provide the analysis. And a balanced budget would be one. We could say here's the effects, the economic effects of moves toward a balanced budget, and I certainly do that. And so, for example, one of the points I make is that people talk about pay-go, and so a move toward pay-go would be, in some sense, a move toward fiscal adjustment. But there's a sense in which pay-go by itself actually a little bit makes the problem worse. It makes it harder, because the things that are being used as a pay for, of course, are no longer available to address the existing imbalance, right, which is quite large. So if you think of like pay-go as taking away the low-hanging fruit, well, then the subsequent decisions are yet more difficult.
Let me ask a different way. How do you help members think through the trade-off between the benefits that they could provide to the public now? So whether it's paid leave, health care, whatever the policy is, versus whatever the future costs might be if we run into the sort of deficit and debt problem that you talked about at the top. Like, how do you help members think about that now versus future
versus the
trade-off.
future.
And in
No,
particular,
it's-
just to
yeah,
add
please.
onto that, the potential benefits of a fiscal stimulus, of another tax cut, or whatnot.
Yeah.
And if you can do that all in less than 2 minutes or so.
I certainly will.
Yeah.
No, I'll hit the high points here. It's difficult because these trade-offs between today, the potential immediate benefits of the sorts of things that you talked about, whether it's on the tax side, on the spending side, we do our best. And so, our first focus, of course, is on the fiscal side, the cost. But we know members don't want to know just what it costs. We want to know they want to know what are the benefits, and we try to set that out as much as we can. How many people will be insured? How many people will take advantage of paid family leave, and so on. Those are the sorts of benefits that we try to set out, and not make a judgment. Right? That's for the policymakers. That's for members. We'll tell them the costs, the benefits as much as we can. They have to decide the trade-off. The longer term is harder, right? So at what point will the fiscal imbalance pose a threat? We know it's out there. It's not in our 10-year horizon. We don't see it there, but it's out there somewhere, and we can tell policymakers to be cognizant of it, but we don't know exactly when that will come.
Before you go, we started by talking about your big report on debt and deficit. It came out at the end of January. Were you surprised that debt merited no mention in the State of the Union address?
No, there's a sense in which we support the Congress, and we are so focused on the policies of the Congress that, we don't do the analysis of what the president is doing, what the campaign is doing, all that. We focus on what the Congress is.
Would you like him to have mentioned it?
It's just not for me to have an opinion on that.
We'll have to end it there. CBO Director Phill Swagel, thanks for being our newsmaker this week.
Yeah, thank you.
And now we continue with the roundtable portion of Newsmakers with Rich Rubin of the Wall Street Journal, Jim Tankersley of the New York Times. We started and ended that discussion with Director Swagel on debt and deficit. You two have covered a lot of hand-wringing on Capitol Hill over your careers when it comes to debt and deficit issues. How much hand-wringing did that latest report by CBO cause on Capitol Hill?
I think it was sort of a re-hand-wringing of all the hand-wringing that's been done. I mean, in some ways, their outlook hasn't changed. They know we've got persistently high deficits in a period when you wouldn't normally expect it, when we've got low unemployment. And so, and the long-term picture is, their debt curve goes like this. So in some ways, it's sort of reaffirming on Capitol Hill what everybody has already known and what members have sort of deprioritized. Members have made the decision in recent years to emphasize tax cuts now, spending now, and either make the implicit or explicit decision that those future issues would be just dealt with in the future.
Yeah, during the tail end of President Obama's 2 terms, there was sort of an agreement among Democrats and Republicans that no one really liked, that held down spending growth on areas Republicans wanted to grow, which was defense, and on areas that Democrats wanted to grow, which is other domestic programs like research and education. And now we have the opposite consensus, where they've just agreed to spend what everybody wants, basically, on those programs, and then also Republicans passed their tax cuts on top of that. And so those two, combined with this sort of underlying demographic driver of larger debts over time, are really sort of yielding this explosion of both hand-wringing on the one hand and inaction on the other. Has never been a greater divide, I think, in Washington between the amount of time people spend talking about the deficit and the amount of time they actually spend working to reduce it. And that's an interesting development, I think, compared to a few years ago.
And in some ways, that's a reflection of the economic reality that we have, which is, as the director said, if you had asked him 10 years ago, like, if we had this level of debt and deficit, would there be bad economic consequences? The consensus would have been yes. And the reality on the ground has been different. And I think that reality has been in part what's changed the policies. And so you see now people talk about deficits, but even the Democrats on the campaign trail are very much trying to align their spending proposals with their tax proposals so they wouldn't make projected deficits worse. But there's not then a focus beyond that on deficit reduction.
You mentioned the campaign trail. What did you think about his answer to the question about CBO's role in some of the policy proposals that have come up on the campaign trail?
Yeah, I mean, it's like playing basketball. Like you have to get to the spot on the floor where the ball is going to be, and that's essentially what they're trying to do for 2021 is to see what's out there on the campaign trail and know that they have to have that analytic capacity in place, because as we've seen in 09 and 17, new presidents and new majorities come in and they're ready to go and push through policies within a matter of weeks or months. And so the nonpartisan plumbing of Congress, CBO, and the Joint Committee on Taxation have to be ready for that.
And if the president's reelected, he has already indicated he will push for a second tax cut measure. There will be obviously modeling to be done on that. There will be presumably second-term initiatives, although we haven't seen as many of those from the president as from his potential rivals on the Democratic side. But I really think that it was important what the director got at with the scope of the possible changes if a Democrat is elected. It will be unlike anything they've had to estimate before. And his words about needing to have humility in those models and those predictions, I think is very important, particularly since CBO is so often seen as the final word on these things.
For the final word, with less than a minute left, did anything he brought up surprise you in what you've heard from him in the past and what you heard today?
I don't know if it surprised me, but it really did strike me when we were talking about measures to boost the U.S. economy over time, that he singled out immigration policy as a way to bring bring more workers in and to make existing workers more productive.
Yeah, same. It's a reiteration of what they've said, but in response to the Treasury Secretary saying this week that he thought the tax cuts were going to pay for themselves, the director said, no, we think they'll pay for about 20% of themselves. And so that's, again, this divide between the rosy forecasts and estimates from the administration and CBO's much more small c, conservative kind of view of the world.
Rich Rubin of the Wall Street Journal, Jim Tankersley, the New York Times. Thanks so much for being on Newsmakers this week.
Thanks.
Thank you.